Those of you who don't know me, my name is Brittany Chozinski. I'm in the sociology department. And Jackie, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Jackie Walter. I'm the director of the Center for Women in Church and Society and also the project director for OLU Cares. And we were blessed to have Brittany do this project actually for OLU Cares in an internship that she did an internship with the Center for Women over the summer, working on another degree at UTSA. So we know our students are living with trauma, and so this is a very important topic, and I'm so excited that Brittany really did all the work. So,
well, I wanted to have Jackie here, so I can ask you a question about OLU Cares.
Yes. So if you have any questions about OLU Cares, I'll be happy to answer them. I think we're all amongst friends here, though. Pretty much people know. So I'll let you take it away.
All right, awesome. So I wanted to talk a little bit about trauma-informed practice in higher education. This is something that caught on kind of first in K through 12 education, but now we're starting to see more inclusion at the college level, which is definitely good news. So to start out, I want to kind of put a definition out there of trauma, because it is kind of a word that gets thrown around a lot, but isn't always well defined. I like this particular definition that looks at the 3 E's of trauma. So trauma is defined as an event, a series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has long-lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So the 3 E's kind of define what we consider to be trauma. It isn't just an event. The same event can happen to 2 totally different people, and they might have completely different experiences of it. For one, it may be trauma. For the other, it might not be. So it is the event, but it's the experience of the event, and it's the effects from that event that define something as trauma. What we know is that trauma can be experienced and can manifest very differently in different individuals and in different cultural contexts. So what is considered traumatic in one situation might not, amongst a different group of people, be considered traumatic to them. The same exact experiences can be interpreted very, very differently. So let me kind of open it up to you all. What are some sources of trauma?
Car wreck.
Car wreck, good. What else?
Abuse.
Abuse, good. Physical, sexual, emotional abuse. What else?
Historical.
Historical trauma, good. We'll talk about that one as well. Poverty, good.
Witnessing violence.
Absolutely. So not necessarily direct victimization, but seeing violence can be traumatic.
Losing your parents or very young.
Yeah, loss of a loved one, absolutely. Anything else you want to throw out there?
Divorce.
Suicide, so a close person suicide, loss of a relationship, absolutely, divorce, good. So various forms and types of trauma. You guys hit a bunch of them up here: physical or sexual abuse, abandonment, neglect, loss of a loved one, family violence, poverty, accidents, bullying, witnessing violence. Incarceration is one that we don't often throw out there but need to. Natural disasters and terrorism. So we see that traumatic events can happen not just to individuals but to entire populations. Military combat can also be very traumatic. So with trauma, it can be an acute trauma or it can be chronic traumatic stress, where a person is exposed to a traumatic stressor over time. It can become complex trauma, where trauma after trauma after trauma is kind of layered on top of one another. We also see that there are sort of macro traumatic events. If we think of something like 9/11, that was traumatic for our entire population. And we also have this concept of historical trauma, which doesn't get enough attention. So if we look at marginalized groups, their historical treatment in our culture can be a source of trauma that is inherited and passed on from generation to generation. So it's a very broad spectrum when we're talking about trauma. It can be things perpetuated against an individual, against a group, things directly experienced, things witnessed, things passed down through generations. But the effects of it can all very be similar. So let's look, just to throw some statistic out there, of how prevalent trauma is in our college students. 47% experienced a traumatic event in the past year. About half are exposed to a potentially traumatizing event in their first year of college. By college, 66 to 85% of youth report lifetime traumatic event exposure, with many reporting multiple exposures. So to say this is something that our students are dealing with is absolutely true. It's not even an argument, really. If we look at before college, when they're coming to us as kids becoming adults in the world, 26% of children in the US witness or experience trauma before age 4, so happening at a very, very young age. 61% of youth in 2013-14 report exposure to some form of violence or abuse in the past year alone. And in one very interesting survey I found that was looking at a school district in an urban school district primarily serving Latino students living in poverty, not terribly unlike the zip code we are currently in right now. They surveyed over 28,000 sixth graders and found that 94% had been exposed to trauma in the past year alone. 40% had reported direct victimization with use of a weapon. So this is something that it is very likely that our students are carrying with them when they come through our doors and into our classrooms. And it's something we've been talking about for a long time. We know that adverse experiences in childhood, or adverse childhood experience, ACEs, can have long-lasting impacts on children. So the kind of seminal study on this was the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention did a study of over 9,000 adults that asked them retrospectively about their childhood experiences of trauma. What they found is that more than half of them experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. As the number of adverse childhood experiences increased, so did the negative outcomes or the negative effects of that. So they actually found a graded relationship to adult diseases and risk factors for common causes of death in the United States. The more adverse childhood experiences, the more at risk these individuals were for these health outcomes. And what we saw with that graded relationship is that it multiplied the risk pretty substantially. So for people who reported 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, they had 4 to 12 times the rate of alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, suicide attempts. They had 2 to 4 times the rate of smoking, poor self-rated health, having more than 50 sexual partners, sexually transmitted infections. And they had a 1.4 to a 1.6% increase in physical inactivity and severe obesity. So lots of health issues are related to these adverse childhood experiences. Now, one of the criticisms of this first study was that it was asking adults to recall things that happened to them in childhood. So just to give you one more follow-up on this, more recent study, the National Survey of Children's Health looked at children instead of asking adults retroactively about their experiences and found that about the same, 48% of kids experience at least one adverse childhood experience. So on top of that, they found that certain populations are at even higher risk of ACEs. Kids living in poverty, children of color, children with public health insurance or no insurance, children with chronic health conditions. These kids are especially at risk of experiencing adverse childhood experiences. So if we put all that together, one thing we can kind of realize off the bat is that students with histories of trauma are by no means new in our college. This is not a recent thing that has popped up and is now getting our attention because this wave of traumatized students is coming to college. They've always been there. We just haven't always noticed they were there or paid attention to how we should be working with them. So the transition we're starting to see now is trauma-informed care, which in a nutshell means moving from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. So instead of looking at a child that is a young adult, in our case, who is engaging in a way that we feel is problematic, instead of blaming them for that behavior, we're trying to figure out what the source of that behavior is. So when we talk about trauma-informed practice, what we're trying to do is to understand the impacts of trauma on learning and to avoid re-traumatizing them. This is not the same thing as trauma-specific services, which would be delivered by trained professionals, which I am definitely not. Right? So these are our social workers, our counselors, different field of study for me. But our goal in any classroom, in any office setting, in any college institution, is to make sure that we are not re-traumatizing students. That's sort of the very least we can do. So in order to do that, I think it is beneficial to understand a little bit better how trauma impacts the individual. So it's important to note that trauma affects the whole person, from their worldview to their brain development, to their attachment to others, their self-esteem, their behavior, their ability to emotionally regulate. There's very little that trauma is going to overlook in its impact. And what may seem like a maladaptive behavior to an outsider may actually be a misplaced survival skill that has been incredibly useful to them elsewhere. So if a student is doing something that to us seems maladaptive, seems counterproductive, seems problematic, there is a chance that that behavior is what got them through a really bad situation in their past, and we're just not seeing it from the same perspective that they are. So when we talk about our response to trauma, we have to keep in mind that it is absolutely not a choice. The student is not choosing to behave in a specific way. It is a completely automatic response. Now, we've all heard the fight or flight response. There's actually a third F there, which is freeze. So fight, flight, or freeze. So I want to look a little bit more at how exactly trauma impacts the brain to understand what's going on when a person experiences trauma or is triggered later on after having experienced trauma. So you can kind of think of the brain in a very simplistic terms as your old brain and your new brain, right? So old brain is in charge of your primitive functions that keep you alive. New brain is everything we would consider ourselves as civilized, rational, thinking, caring, loving human beings to be, right? So a simple model of this, if I take my thumb and put it in the center of my hand, I've got my old brain there, the new brain kind of wraps around it like that. Okay. So my new brain is responsible for processing the here and now, recalling past events, weighing past with the current, weighing the pros and cons of decisions, and ultimately coming up with a decision on how to act and what I should do. It's that rational part of thinking. The old brain, however, underneath that, is in charge of more primitive things that are aimed simply at keeping us alive. So when we are in a situation of danger, the response to the brain will come primarily from this old brain. So we have kind of 3 different parts of that are important in the stress response to trauma. So the amygdala is going to be constantly scanning the environment looking for threats. When a threat is detected, it is going to send a signal to 2 other parts of the brain that will then trigger a response. The hypothalamus is going to send a trigger to the pituitary glands, which is going to release a flood of hormones into our body that is going to prepare us for either of those 3 options, fight, flight, or freeze. So specifically, we're looking at 4 different types of hormones: adrenaline, which we've all heard of, cortisol, which is a stress hormone, opioids, and oxytocin. All right, so those 4 things kind of flood through our body. The adrenaline is preparing us for that fight or flight. The cortisol is helping to impact our energy level available for that flight or flight. Opioids, we know that word. What are those for? Pain. Good. Oxytocin. Another common one. No? All right. Feel good, warm fuzzies. It's a natural high, a good positive feeling, right? So if we think of what the brain is doing when we are in a threatening situation, it is preparing our body to react. It is making sure that we don't feel pain and that we stay calm so that we still feel good, right? So that is basic survival. We need to be able to get out of a situation without freaking out completely. Now, those flood of hormones can, at high levels, be problematic. So too much cortisol can create a tonic immobility where the person kind of freezes. They lock up in a traumatic situation. Opioids at high levels can block emotions. So sometimes if we see a person who is experiencing trauma but does not appear to be reacting to it, that's actually perfectly normal. They could simply be in a position where their hormonal reaction is blocking that emotion. Oxytocin can, at high levels, cause things that seem like weird reactions to trauma, such as giggling. So you wouldn't expect a person who has just gone through a traumatic situation to sit there and kind of giggle at it. But I have sat with survivors of sexual assault in the emergency room who were giggling as they retold the story of what they went through. And that's that hormonal response. So we kind of get this flood of hormones throughout our body. We also have memory-creating processes going on at this time. So the hippocampus creates memory through encoding and consolidation. Encoding is kind of like the sorting and organizing. Consolidation is where we group like with like. So this is how our brain creates memories that later remind us, when this happens again, I know this is a threat. So if we think of kind of a simple example, simple textbook example, I don't have to relearn every time I see a snake coiled up that I shouldn't pet it. Right? I can remember from the last time that that's probably not a good idea. So my brain is able to recall that memory and warn me that this is something I need to stay away from. That is a very basic survival skill. The problem is that old brain is constantly scanning and looking for things that it sometimes may mistake for a real threat. So have you ever been walking and kind of out of the corner of your eye caught a extension cord or a piece of rope and you thought it was a snake and jumped? Yeah, so that's kind of what's going on there. It's perceiving threat to protect you, but sometimes it's overreacting. So all of this is a completely natural, automatic response to trauma, but it has very intense impacts on kids who are experiencing this sort of thing. So if we look at K through 12, kids may become self-protective with a constant baseline level of feeling of low-level fear. This can divert energy away from things like curiosity, exploration, learning. So instead of focusing on the things we send them to school to actually do, they're focused on the fact that they are constantly afraid. Exposure to 5 or more adverse childhood experiences is also associated with things like a delay in language, emotional, or brain development. So what we see is that sometimes trauma symptoms are misdiagnosed in children as learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder, or emotional and behavioral conduct problems. So when we've got a kid that is, in little kids, a kid that is acting out, that always has to be a concern that potentially there was some experience of trauma there. But we are not K through 12, we are college. So while we should know potentially what K through 12 is bringing to the table, our populations are unique in and of themselves. College students can have a difficult time focusing, remembering, or recalling, particularly when they're in that heightened state of arousal. So if we take our brain model again, normally we want our new brain to be driving the car. This is our rational part of the brain. But if you remember flipping your lid, right? The old brain is now driving the car, and this guy has no say in it anymore. So when they are in that heightened state of arousal, their body is preparing them for survival, this guy's driving the car. That can be triggered by stressful events, public speaking, big deadlines, a big project looming, anniversaries of traumatic situations, anything outside of school that may be stressing them. So it makes it very difficult for them to focus on the basic tasks that allow them to be successful in college. They can also experience things like anger, helplessness, dissociation, missing classes, feeling disconnected from the university. So if you have a student who is frequently absent from class, that is a reason for concern beyond the fact that they just are missing course material, right? So there might be something going on behind that. One of the other things we see is that there's a fear of risk-taking or perfectionism. I think this one gets overlooked a lot because that's almost the ideal student. That's what you want, right? The student that is trying so hard to do everything perfectly, that sometimes is a problematic response because that's a student who's unwilling to take risks or is absolutely terrified of failing. So pay attention not just to the students who aren't showing up and struggling, but those who are perhaps trying too hard to the point that it's becoming problematic for them. Their goals and obligations may be suspended while devoting time and energy to process and working through the traumatic experiences. College is definitely on their plate. It's one of their priorities. They're here, they're trying to learn, they're trying to get their degree, but they're also trying to work through what they've been through in the past. And some days they will be actively processing that trauma. It can also go in the reverse direction. Sometimes they can be so focused on their schoolwork that they're not actively processing that trauma, and that can delay their healing from that traumatic experience as well. Beyond the classroom, students can struggle with relationships, both starting new ones, maintaining current ones, and ending problematic ones. So trauma is, by definition, a relationship boundary violation that can leave students who have experienced trauma in the past with a difficult time in future and current relationships, including their relationship to authority figures. If a child has adverse childhood experiences with the person who was in a position of authority, well, guess what? You're all in positions of authority from the standpoint of our students. So if they seem adverse to interacting with you or they seem standoffish, they might not be reacting to you specifically, but you as an authority figure. Social anxiety, withdrawal, aggression management can also be problematic. Things like managing schoolwork, their extracurricular involvement. People who have experienced trauma are also at risk of repeat traumatization, of being traumatized again by a separate event. The literature talks about learned helplessness, which is it's there's different views on the term, but the idea that individuals who have experienced trauma are at increased risk of being re-traumatized. Some may even come to identify with the aggressor, and we do know that in some instances, people who were abused become abusers themselves. That is not the majority of cases by any means necessary, but it is a possibility. Addictive behaviors is another common response to trauma. So addiction of any sort, whether we're talking about drugs, alcohol, sex, gambling, it restores a temporary sense of control, temporary, to a person who feels that they lack control. One of the things they can actually become addicted to is the stress response itself. So that flood of hormones we talked about can actually become an addictive thing where people intentionally seek out high levels of stress in order to feed that addiction. So all of these are possible reactions with our college students, but some populations are at higher risk than others. Certainly our veterans. We know that thanks to things like the GI Bill, we have more veterans on college campuses today. They bring with them the impacts of their service. So whatever they saw while in combat or whatever they saw while serving, they carry with them into our classrooms. Beyond that, just transitioning from a very structured military life to all of this is a pretty big shift, right? So that itself can be problematic for our vets. If they are additionally dealing with any form of disability as a result of their service, that adds an additional level of complication. One group that gets overlooked quite often or isn't talked about enough, current or former foster youth. So Texas also has financial assistance for college for foster youth, which is amazing, but that means we do have a lot more of them in our colleges than one might expect. They may lack adequate support systems to help them make that transition, and they can struggle with transitions such as coming from the K through 12 into the college arena. But they can also struggle with the transition out of college into the job world. So transitions in general can be difficult. We see with former foster youth especially, they are much more likely to have experienced adverse childhood experiences. And quite frankly, none of us would know if our students were former foster youth unless we had that discussion with them. So this is kind of an invisible category oftentimes. Racial and ethnic minorities may have experienced historical trauma. This can be particularly difficult when you have predominantly white schools. And it can be difficult if you have students who are refugees. So they may be dealing with complex family, financial, or immigration situations. LGBTQ students, we know that there is still a high level of violence and discrimination against LGBTQ people. They are dealing with all of that while dealing with all of this. They also may be dealing with other forms of violence, such as intimate partner violence. So if we look at rates of intimate partner violence for LGBTQ people, they are comparable or higher to those of heterosexual and cisgender people. And their family situations can sometimes be a little bit different. So non-familial adults may be something that they relate better to than familial adults. Having alternative family structures is something that we need to respect in those populations. And finally, our non-traditional adult learners, those who didn't go directly from high school into college. If the reason they delayed their enrollment was in any way related to a traumatic educational experience, guess what's going to happen when they re-enroll in college? So it's all going to come flooding back, and they're not only going to have to deal with that original traumatic educational experience, but with all the years that they've had in between, kind of not being in school. On top of that, our older learners are going to be juggling multiple roles, potentially families of their own, kids, full-time jobs, all of those things that we know they deal with outside of school. So if we take all of this and kind of put it together, I want to talk more concretely about how we can be a trauma-informed campus. A couple easy steps and then we'll get more in-depth into them. So we need to dispel trauma myths, this idea that traumatized individuals are seeking attention or that trauma responses are a choice and they can just turn it off when they want. Presentations like this, having these discussions can help to dispel those sort of myths. Having an awareness of the impacts of trauma, understanding the myriad ways in which trauma impacts the whole person. As a university, we need to work as a connected system to better serve our students who have experienced trauma. It's not enough to have disjointed efforts in the classroom, in the administration, in student services. It has to all flow together. We need to make sure that their physical, social, and emotional safety is supported. Safety is not just a matter of being physically safe, there's far more to it than that. We need to holistically address student needs. So it's easy to think about things like, to be successful in college, you have to go to class and have your books and do your homework, but you also have to eat and have a place to sleep and having a loving relationship with someone who supports and cares for you. So more holistic care of our students. Explicitly connecting them to the community helps to take some of that burden off of us. So making sure that students are invested in a world beyond just OLU, because someday they will leave us and they have to be connected to that community. And a big help in all of this, and an important part of it, is that we engage them in leadership and participation in their own development. So not doing things for them, but doing things with them. So I want to kind of break these down into 3 different pillars, which taken from Bath 2008. So we can look at trauma-informed care as being composed of safety, connections, and managing emotions. So in terms of safety, we want to be consistent, reliable, predictable, available, honest, and transparent with our students at all times. If we're looking at the larger college campus, that means things like welcoming signs, visual materials that are easy to see and readily available, appropriate bathrooms, and we don't have to get into a discussion about gender in bathrooms, but appropriate bathrooms, including accessible bathrooms. Accessibility is a big one. Having exits that are clearly marked and easily accessible. Things like designing with accessibility in mind so that our students don't have to worry about those additional barriers. It's also extremely important that as a campus we have a strong non-tolerance of violence. Any incident that occurs needs to be addressed promptly, firmly, and decisively. So we cannot afford to have it be perceived by victims of trauma or victims of violence on campus that we're not willing to deal with it, or that it is something that's too taboo for us to touch. It has to be very decisively dealt with clear rules and an effective response. In order to have physical safety, though, it really depends on having connections with others. Now, when we're talking about connections, we're looking at quality, not quantity. So making sure that students have someone that they are closely connected with. They don't necessarily have to have a million friends. I'm more of a 2 to 3 friend kind of person. So having that strong quality connections, which also includes connections to the community. One of the things we see is that college is an amazing introductory point to mental health services, especially if students are coming from a home environment or a community in which mental health might have been stigmatized or perhaps not available to them. We can make those explicit connections to the community to help introduce them to what's available out in the world. Trustworthiness. Children may have learned to distrust adults. We can't necessarily change that right off the bat, but we can do everything possible in our power to try and make ourselves appear trustworthy, which includes maintaining appropriate boundaries with students. While we want to be there and be supportive for them, we don't want to be overly supportive to the point that develops codependence, right? So we don't want to make ourselves too available. Transparency of goals and outcomes. I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that when I get to looking at the classroom specifically. But being very clear with students about what they're trying to accomplish and what outcomes are being aimed at. Empowerment and collaboration. So things like having a student advisory board, joint planning or evaluation of any efforts we engage in. Anything we can do to do with students instead of doing for or doing to them. So as we start to think about how we as a campus want to be more trauma informed, students absolutely have to be involved in that discussion. It's not something that we can decide for them. And finally, managing emotions. So it is not at all true that our emotional development ends after we become adults. There are many adults that are still trying to figure that one out. You can learn new skills of emotional management at any point in your life. And the best way we can teach our students that is to model that behavior ourselves. So co-regulating, having them watch us do what we would like them to someday do is a good method of modeling how we would like them to learn to manage their emotions. Actively listening to students, but not being afraid to label troublesome emotions. So being willing not to call someone out, but to mention that I can see you're struggling with something, or to point what seems like a maladaptive behavior out and giving them the opportunity to talk to you while actively listening to their explanation. Rational processing, reflecting on feelings, impulses, really just having those discussions that we sometimes avoid instead of jumping to conclusions about what's wrong with you, trying to figure out what happened to them. So let's break that down a little bit more specifically. What can we do in the classroom and beyond? As we've kind of said, students bring their entire lives onto campus and into the classroom. Some days they will be actively responding to trauma. And our goal is not to fix them, it's not to heal them, but to avoid re-traumatizing them and to support whatever growth we possibly can. So I have a couple more concrete suggestions for what we can do in the classroom, but this also applies to anyone who works with students in offices or any type of student meetings. So the structure of our environment is important. Classrooms need to be laid out in a way that clearly promotes safety. If you have a student who needs to sit in a position where they can see and access the exit at all times, which is not uncommon with our veteran students, then the classroom needs to be arranged in a fashion where that is possible. There needs to be clear exit lines and an ability to get to them if needed. Limited instructor to student ratios. We are at a great college to discuss that. We don't have this huge auditorium, 300-person classes, right? But even if you have a class that deals with a subject matter that you think might be triggering for some students, limiting that even more. So for example, in my violence class, when I teach it face-to-face, I cap it at 15, because realistically that's all we can have in there without those students shutting down or not talking or perhaps saying something that they didn't necessarily want to say to that large group. So a limited instructor to student ratio within means is going to allow us to have that closer connection to our students. Consistency, so scheduling, structure of the classroom, the way in which things occur in your classroom needs to be very clearly laid out, but at the same time you have to model flexibility when things go wrong. So you want to have a very predictable pattern of how you run your classrooms or how you run your meetings. But if something comes up, you need to show them that the world doesn't end when things happen like that. One of the biggest ways that I try and accomplish this in my classes is through the syllabus. So I think we underestimate the value of a course syllabus. That to me is a course contract. So in it, I outline their rights, their responsibilities, the rules of my classroom, their processes for requesting any additional accommodations beyond letters of accommodation. So that syllabus outlines not only my expectations of them, but what they can expect of me, down to the most minute detail. So if they email me, I tell them how long it will take me to respond. If they submit something for grading, I tell them how long before they will get that back from me. If there is a assignment they want to turn in late, so it's very clearly labeled what the consequences of late work are if it's accepted. The schedule with all reading assignments is laid out on that first day of class, and believe me, I understand how difficult that is to do in advance of the semester. But if they can look ahead and see this is what I'm looking at, that makes it all that much easier on them. Setting and enforcing limits in a consistent way with high expectations for all. So we want to be very consistent with the expectations we have for our students, the limits and the routines we have. Something going on? Thinks your battery.
I don't think it's coming from.
No. All right. There we go. We got it. Okay. So consistency is the big thing here. So when I say I outline all of my rules in the syllabus, when I get inevitably those requests for something beyond what was outlined in the syllabus, my response is always, my policies are outlined in the syllabus. These will be applied equally to all students. Now that doesn't mean that I'm going to be heartless and not listen to extenuating circumstances. Obviously I will do that, and that happens. But you cannot seem as if you are arbitrarily applying rules to some students and not to other students. If you think of, for example, a child who was abused in their childhood, they had no ability to predict when that abuse was coming. They had no ability to predict when those consequences would be put on them. So they didn't know if they did something right, if they were going to get hit. If they did something wrong, if they were going to get hit. If they did nothing at all, if they were going to get hit. So if you arbitrarily apply rules to some students but not to others, in some situations but not to others, you're kind of rehashing that for them. So we have to very consistently apply them, and to me, having it all in writing very clearly is my key to doing that. Having appropriate and helpful relationships with students. So being aware that you can check in with them. I think we all kind of do that to make sure they're understanding the material periodically, but just seeing how they're doing every once in a while. As you get to know them, if an anniversary of a traumatic event is coming up, preparing for that and being aware that that might impact them. Understanding that they may have a distrust of authority figures, and that is not necessarily a personal issue with you, but you are an authority figure to that individual. And really working to maintain those boundaries. So I said earlier that trauma is inherently a boundary violation issue. What that can create, though, is difficulty in maintaining boundaries and relationships in the future. So students can have difficulties understanding where appropriate boundaries are. They can be very sensitive to boundary crossing, but at the same time, they can cross boundaries themselves. So they may not only have boundary issues with their own personal boundaries, they may misinterpret the boundaries of other people and try to form intense, unrealistic relationships. It's very tempting when you have a student who is showing need of your attention and a desire for your help to allow them to latch on like that, but it is not helpful to them. So teaching them professional, appropriate boundaries is a tough lesson sometimes, but it is an important one to help them work through their growth. Actively listening. We don't actively listen often enough. Most of the time when someone is talking to us, we are thinking of what we want to say in response, which means we're not listening to them at all. So learning to be fully present and actively listening, checking in for understanding. Asking them questions instead of assuming we know the answers. It's perfectly fine to make observations to students about their behavior, but we shouldn't assume that we know why they're behaving in that way. So I see that you've missed several classes this semester. Can you tell me what's going on? Instead of, I see you've missed several classes, I can tell that you don't want anything to do with this class, right? So fully listening to their responses. When working with our marginalized populations, we also have to be aware of the power relationships that are inherent there. So we want to practice cultural humility and acknowledge those power imbalances, valuing both native and non-native language, whatever native may be, whether we're talking indigenous populations, veterans, valuing other sources of knowledge beyond our own is important. Positioning learning as a dialogue between equals rather than one person just lecturing at you for however long the course is. And being aware of our course content. So certain topics can activate past memories. We get the term trigger, which kind of has mixed responses. Some people like it, some people hate it. I prefer the word activate because that's exactly what it's doing. It's activating that stress response. When that occurs, when a student is triggered, they are not fully present. They are reacting to the traumatic experience in the moment as it happens to them. So it is a situation in which we have to be aware of the content covered in our classes. Now this is, of course, more relevant to some classes than others, but we may want to warn them that the content may be discomforting or distressing, and to discuss in advance how we want to handle that when it comes up. We also, in that same vein, need to address appropriate sharing and encourage boundary maintenance within the classroom. So the first thing I do in my violence class on the first day of class is we construct a course contract, and they write it, I don't write it. I ask them questions and they respond. When this happens, how would you like me to respond? When this happens, how will you respond? When this situation comes up, what's our game plan? So we collectively engage in shared governance of the classroom, but we openly address appropriate boundaries. We address oversharing. You know, this is still a classroom. These are the goals of our class. While feelings and thoughts may come up and you are permitted and encouraged to share, you know, this isn't group therapy, so we need to be careful that we're not oversharing. So things like that are important. Providing them with resources, self-care resources, university resources, community resources, and really maintaining a growth mindset. So intelligence is by no means fixed, it is entirely elastic, and as is their ability to grow in other ways as well. Students can continue to learn self-efficacy and social and emotional skills well into adulthood. So we need to encourage them to explore and learn in the context of their own experiences. This has been, in my experience as a teacher the absolute most rewarding part of being in front of a classroom of students. It's not just teaching them, but allowing them to learn in the context of their own experiences, to make sense of their own life and apply what we're learning to their understanding of themselves and to the world. So we don't have to take trauma as this thing that is shut out, ignored, never talked about. Our experiences make us who they are, who we are, and it brings so much experience to the classroom, right? At the same time, though, we have to be very careful that we're not romanticizing trauma, right? So we talked today not just about post-traumatic stress, but post-traumatic growth. Or there's this idea that after trauma, a person recovers and grows from it. It's possible, but it's not always the case. So one of the things that I think we do out of such good intentions, but it's such a bad idea, is we tell people everything will be fine, it'll all work out, or my favorite, it gets better. You can't say that, because sometimes it stays the same, and sometimes it gets worse. We say that because we want it to get better. We want everything to work out. We really, truly hope that things get better for them. But you can't promise that to them, because if you do that and then it doesn't get better, they will blame themselves. They will feel that it's their fault that it didn't get better, that they didn't do what was necessary to grow. So we have to be open to and encourage growth, but we cannot build expectations of it. It is not guaranteed. With coursework, make any instructions you give them clear and available. And to those of you who work outside of the classroom, same thing applies. If you can give instructions verbally and in writing, that is beautiful, right? So remember, students may have issues with memory and recall, particularly when stressed out. So having things available in Blackboard or a handout. If you have a discussion with someone and you say, I know that we went over this, and this step to do today. Here's a nice little handout that summarizes everything I need you to do from here on out. Or take notes and give them your notes. Things that can allow them to recall those situations later on. Offering limited choices when possible. We want to encourage them to build a sense of agency, and we want to praise their positive choices. So for example, when I do a writing assignment in response to a prompt, I'll give them a couple different prompts to choose from. You don't want to just give them free rein, where you say, write me a paper, pick a topic, because that can be overwhelming. But if I say, here's 5 topics, I'd really be interested in you exploring one of them, and praising them when they pick a topic that they can really master can help to build that sense of agency. Engaging in peer helping interactions. It's not just us, their peers are exceptionally helpful as well. Things like peer tutoring, peer discussion groups. If you do discussions in your classroom, I would encourage you to think about giving them time to think, to write, or to have small group discussions before you engage the whole group. So I may ask a question to the class and then say, hey, break off, talk with your neighbors, and then we'll come back together and share. It reduces that stress load of having to talk in front of people and think of your answers right as they're coming up. Facilitating discussion deliberately. This can become an issue, or it might not be, kind of depends on who you're working with, but we've all had those classrooms where you've got one student that kind of grandstands instead of discusses whenever discussion questions are asked. So very deliberately facilitating discussion. I highly recommend Eve Tuck. She's an Indigenous feminist scholar who talks about Indigenous methodologies. So her work is excellent on how to very deliberately facilitate discussion. Providing feedback is also important. So ongoing positive feedback, especially when they face obstacles, highlighting their strengths, looking at mistakes as an opportunity for improvement or practice, and really reframing consequences so that they don't seem like punishment, because it will be interpreted as punishment. The slightest tweak here can make a world of difference. So for example, I have a late work policy, but I'd never call it a late work penalty. I do not say that I take points off if you turn something in late. I say that points expire daily, which is literally the exact same thing, but they love it. So it's no longer a punishment, it's no longer a consequence, it's reframed as something that is more positive. All right, so what if you have a student who has flipped their lid, right? So they are freaking out, they're in a high stress response situation. I do want to talk briefly about de-escalation. Right? So if I have a student who is kind of in that moment, what do? Signs of a situation that might require de-escalation: they are engaging in irrational actions, they have a flushed face, they're speaking in disjointed sentences. They don't seem physically present. They feel like they may be elsewhere when they're talking to you. The absolute most important thing, and the hardest part of this, is to not mirror them. So mirror neurons respond very, very quickly. When we see someone freak out, we freak out. And then guess what that does to them? And then it just keeps stepping up and up and up. So you need to maintain calmness. You need to move slowly and deliberately. Be aware of your own safety, but you're trying to get the student to mirror your actions, your behaviors, your demeanor, your calmness. So instead of focusing on them, focus on yourself. Actively listen, though, as you're doing that. Don't think about what you're going to say to them next. Don't stress over what is the best thing to say to fix this situation. You don't need to say anything. You need to listen to them. Give them space, but don't force it. So suggesting something like a non-punitive cool down time, an optional cool down time. Do you feel like maybe you want to go take a walk, right? It's not, I need you to go take a walk. That's a punishment. Do not, under any circumstances, talk at them, touch them, crowd them, or give them complicated directions. So if a person is in a very stressed out, agitated situation, I do not want to place my hand on them in any way. It's going to aggravate them. It's going to make it worse. But also crowding them, making sure that I haven't backed them into a corner or made them feel like a cornered animal, essentially. Remember that they are in a very primitive state of response. Not talking at them, so making sure that you are listening to them and processing what they're saying. Complicated directions. We're talking little itty bitty baby sentences here, and that is as much as they are going to process. This guy is driving the car, this guy is not. Here's your rational processing, he's nowhere to be found. Once they start to calm down though, our goal is to get this guy back in the car, right? And we can do that by trying to re-engage the rational part of the brain. You can suggest simple tasks or ask them for help, such as, could you remind me again how to spell your name? Counting backwards from 10. You can Google grounding techniques is another great thing to look at if you want to learn how to deal with students in a state like this. But very simple tasks that just get them to think, get them to re-engage that rational part of the brain. As they start to come back down and start to calm down a bit, you want to ask for their help in what to do next. They are the expert in their own care, not you. So I can tell you're not ready to engage in work yet, but maybe would you feel okay helping me out with yada, 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 okay? So very calmly trying to get them to mirror you while trying to re-engage that rational brain. It's kind of the takeaway from those. Now, any discussion of working with students who may have experienced trauma also needs to include a discussion of how working with trauma can create trauma. So the literature talks about indirect trauma in two forms, vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. Honestly, the two terms are used interchangeably quite frequently. Vicarious trauma can be a shift in worldview that comes from frequent exposure to trauma. So for example, ER nurses who see trauma constantly can internalize that trauma and become traumatized by their trauma, right? Secondary trauma is when someone else's trauma is experienced as trauma by us. So it is experienced the same as primary trauma, even though it didn't happen to us. So we need to be aware that we too can be traumatized by the events that we hear. That's particularly important when we talk about sharing in the classroom. One of the reasons we have to be careful what student shares because we don't want their story to cause secondary trauma for someone else in the classroom. But for us, as educators, as people working with students, we also have to be aware of compassion fatigue. So compassion fatigue is sometimes called the cost of caring. It's not the same as burnout. So burnout results from low job satisfaction and no control at work, right? Compassion fatigue is more of an emotional erosion that occurs over time because you're not able to refuel or to regenerate. So you start to become callous and not caring as much as you should care about the individuals you're working with. So I can tell you I worked as a crisis intervention specialist for 7 years with survivors of sexual assault, and at about year 3 I hit some major compassion fatigue, and I got to a point where I was not responding to my survivors in an empathetic way at all, and I talked to my boss and said I need to take some time off to fix this. So being aware of our own self-care needs are important, as well as being aware of our own boundaries and our own identification with students. If we can say that students have experienced this much trauma, The hidden message is so have we. So the faculty and staff have also experienced just as much trauma. So we need to be careful that they are not triggering our own experiences, because again, that is just going to escalate things up and up and up and up. We don't want to over-identify with students to the point that that causes us to experience trauma in some way. All right, so this is kind of a lot to remember. So I want to give you some important points, and then we'll kind of wrap it up and open it up for questions. So important things to remember: the student is the expert on their own feelings and experiences. Ask them for guidance on what to do. Not only does that show that you trust them, but it helps build a sense of agency in their ability to tackle their own growth and their own healing. Be transparent and trustworthy, but don't expect trust. You need to do everything in your power to allow them to know you can be trusted, but never expect that they will. If they do share their experiences or feelings with you, it is incredibly important that you validate those experiences, that it is perfectly natural what they are feeling, you hear them. Behavior that you see as problematic, keep in mind, may have served them well in the past, and because of that, they may be reluctant to change that behavior that worked. Even if you're pointing out that it's maladaptive in a school setting, it may have been what helped them to survive their traumatic experience previously. Promote resilience, basic things that we all don't get enough of, right? Sleep, eating well, exercising, taking care of our mental health. That's that holistic student care that we talked about. Listen, the biggest thing I encountered when I was training new crisis intervention specialists was, what do I say? What's the perfect thing to say? Which is to ask, how do I fix it? How do I fix it? How do I fix it, right? You can't. There is no perfect thing to say. The perfect thing to do is to listen to them and validate what you hear. Refer them to appropriate resources. Unless you are a trained practitioner, then please by no means practice on the students. Right? We have an excellent counseling service. We have connections with resources within the community. Refer them to those. And continue learning, continue training, improving our entire campus community. Things like this are very important as we kind of progress towards being more trauma-informed. So to me, if we kind of look at the core values and the mission of this university, I don't think any of this is possible without being trauma-informed. Quality, innovative experiences aren't going to happen if we're not helping students to deal with what they bring to the table. Any growth, professional, personal, or spiritual, can be exceptionally difficult if we're not meeting those basic needs of students. And certainly preparing them for continued service and success beyond the university requires that. So I kind of threw a lot at you, but I wanted to get through it all. We've got 8 minutes left. I would be happy to answer any questions you have.
I loved your presentation, and lots of students are coming to mind in situations about students. And so I feel like it's getting more and more complex in the classroom and outside, both inside and outside. And so particularly as the number of students are using our ADA. And so I see sometimes a lack of clarity, like, you know, trying to be trauma-informed to respond in those ways. And then, so what's an accommodation? So for example, I had a student who was turning in late work, right? That was part of the accommodation, given extended time. And so I said, no, so per the course outline, you know, submit that, upload that to Blackboard. And then she wrote back and she said, well, I don't think you're taking my accommodation seriously. And so I said, so in what way? Because we've done, you know, everything. I met with her beyond, and then so she'd say, well, I want to talk to you after class, and then she wasn't coming to class. After class, she'd leave, and so I wrote her a note, and I said, so you'd really like to meet her class, but you always immediately exit. And so then she said, well, I have to go and take care of my angels. So then I said, well, what about before class and an appointment time? And so she didn't respond. I sent her multiple emails, and then she wrote me back, and she said, again, something along the lines, you're not taking that seriously, and she'd bring that up. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, so I'm not sure what else I can do with that. And there is trauma there. Mm-hmm. But there's also, so she's talked with me about issues with other classes, with other teachers, with other students. And so she's asked me to do some mediation, which frankly I'm reticent to do
Yeah.
with that student. I have real concerns about that because of things that are spilling over to other classes. But see, so it's all at this point very murky to me.
Sure. So I would say ADA is about the law, trauma-informed practice is about the student. We have to meet ADA to meet the law, but to me, ADA is not sufficient to meet the student needs. So you have to make sure that you're checking the box for ADA to meet the letter of the law. Beyond that, in helping the student, you need to remain consistent with it. So if she is repeatedly asking for help, then repeatedly offer help. And if she's repeatedly not showing up, continue to repeatedly offer help. You can't force her to the table, but you have to make sure the table's kind of always set when she is ready. But don't expect that again. So if she is actively processing trauma, then her response sounds not terribly surprising. Stepping in with interactions in other classrooms, I would communicate that you're not comfortable doing that, so that's maintaining those boundaries. That you would be very open to helping her succeed in your class, but encouraging her to have those discussions with other classes. And encouraging her to reach out to Jackie, to counseling, to someone else at the university, I think, because it does sound like there's more going on there.
Yeah, I did that. She said that she's receiving services at the VA. So
It's a start.
There's some conflict, she said.
Yeah. Yeah, but don't expect it to get better. That is probably one of the most frustrating things in any helping profession. Keep serving and expect to get nothing back. All right.
Oh, it's okay, we can talk about it later. I was just gonna say, I'm on a school advisory board for just like school safety. And one of the newer things that ISDs are doing is that if it's actually law enforcement or fire reaching out to the school and saying, hey, this child witnessed violence, or this child was involved in a car wreck, or this child was violently abused, and they let the school know. And then that sends a team. And they're only doing it in one school district right now. They're doing some research on it, but I thought it's really interesting. There's some kind of notification, and you said that when you were talking about everybody being connected or having some type of connection, and how we can think about that in a different way.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how that turns out. I am both hopeful and suspicious.
Right, you would think that, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd be very interested to see how that turns out. I mean, especially with childhood trauma, it's not spoken about openly.
They don't talk about what happened to the student. They just tell the student they had a traumatic event that happened 24 hours ago or 48 hours ago. Be aware if the student's sleeping or they don't
So it's like a doctor's
talk about
note,
it.
basically.
Yeah.
Okay, so that sounds a little more.
One of my friends started the program with FAISD that works with, but she said that it has really made a difference.
Yeah.
A young woman there was a family violence in the home, and she, the police reported to school that there was an incident. Well, then she finds out the student isn't at home, but she had been expelled because she had gotten in a fight the day before, but there's this violence going on in her home. So she said, bring her into school. And they, got counseling for her and intervened, but that whole community.
For the connection of different resources, just everyone knowing.
But yeah, and I think the more we can do, we don't want to intervene and then step in for other students when they ask us to, like kind of the situation you brought up. But if something happens, we do kind of have that responsibility as a community to make those connections.
And know, just know.
Yeah,
that
to know. And you don't have to know
our brain.
specifics of things.
Exactly. We need to know, it kind of changes our brain and how we're.
Yeah, you perceive things entirely differently when you know that a student has experienced something like that. Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, thank you for giving up an hour to listen.